In March 2015, I woke up around 3 a.m. I have no idea why. Usually I wake up to drink water or use the bathroom, but I needed neither of those this time. I was living in Southern California at the time, near Camp Pendleton, and where I lived there was just my neighborhood and then wilderness. There was nothing beyond my neighborhood for miles, just land. Just an FYI, I have always been into the supernatural, but I don't really think I believed until this experience. Before I went to sleep, I opened my window because it was hot, and I had my curtains open and my shades open. I pulled them up to make sure that the air was getting in. So here I am, 3 a.m., and waking up. I just looked out of my window, which was right next to my bed, and I thought I saw someone standing at the crosswalk across the street. I thought to myself, that's so weird, because usually we didn't have any runners or early morning walkers until about 4:45. So I got up and I went to my window so I could get a closer look, and what I saw I will never ever forget. This thing was standing, but its legs were bent, and it had some white fur covering the body. However, I could still see some skin. Its back was hunched over, and its face looked like some sort of dog. If this creature was standing straight up, I'd say it would have been about 7 or 8 feet tall. Now mind you, this was at 3 a.m., so I was like, okay, you're hallucinating, just go back to sleep. However, I was literally paralyzed and could not take my eyes off of this creature. Its nose and ears looked just so similar to a dog's, or some sort of wolf or coyote. Where I lived, coyotes were very prevalent. However, they never really came into the neighborhood. So, as you can tell, I was just completely shocked and nervous, and as I was about to shut my window, this thing turned its head and stared right at me. It was standing directly under a streetlight, so I could see its features very clearly. Its eyes were so black, but somehow they were shining to where you could really see them staring right into your soul. That did it for me. I slammed my window shut, pulled down the blinds, closed the curtains, and jumped right into bed while pulling the covers over my face. I never went back to sleep that night. Flash forward 2 years later, in June of 2017. I again woke up, but this time I was just hungry. So I went downstairs to get some food and sat at my kitchen table. In the chair that I sat, my back was facing the window on the side of the house. This window was about a foot off the ground, and it was open about 10 inches because my mom forgot to shut it. Now, that window had no screen because it got torn somehow, and we just didn't get around to replacing it yet. Anyway, I had my earbuds in and was watching a movie or show. I can't really exactly remember which, but I heard a noise. I couldn't tell if it was from the movie or from outside, so I paused it and listened. I then heard heavy breathing, but I've never heard this kind of breathing before, and it was coming from directly behind me, right outside of that window. The breathing was rough, rigid, and sounded not anything like a human. I was too scared to turn around, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had goosebumps everywhere. That breathing lasted for about 2 minutes, and then I heard heavy footsteps as this thing was walking away. After about 10 minutes or so passed, I shut the window and locked it, closed the curtains, and ran up to my room. I told my parents about my first encounter the next day after it happened. I was 16 at the time and still living with them. They just kind of looked at me and laughed. They said I was seeing things and that it was probably just a coyote. I told them about my second encounter the next day after it happened too, and at the time they really thought I was just tired and hearing things. My question to everyone out there, have you experienced something similar to this? Was it just a coyote? Or do you guys think it was a hallucination? It's been bothering me for a long time now. I had to get my story out there because I can't deal with no answers. So please, tell me what you think this creature was. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was in 1995 while we were still living in Puerto Rico. We immigrated to the United States in 2001, but before we did, we lived on my grandparents' property. We witnessed something that most people think is fictitious, but it really did happen to us. My name is Gabriel, but you can call me Gabe. I was only 7 years old at the time that my father was attacked by this creature, but I remember it very vividly. I remember how hurt he looked and how we had to take him to the hospital. It was very scary for a kid my age to see his father covered in blood and talking about a creature that had attacked him. Our household consisted of my grandparents, my mother and father, my two older brothers, myself, and my little sister. My father was the only one that went out there the night of the attack, and consequently was the only person that was injured by that creature that he was trying to scare off of our home. My grandfather used to raise parakeets for money. He was also a carpenter, but the parakeets provided a side income that he would use to spend on things that he and my grandmother wanted. I loved going out and looking at them. I loved all the different colors that they had. There were 20 to 30 parakeets at any given time. He used to keep them in this big chicken coop that had all these little houses that they could go in and breed with each other. He took very good care of them, and even kept some of them as pets. I always used to ask my mom and dad if I could keep one, and they told me in a few years they would let me have one for my birthday. I really liked the ones that were blue and white with the black stripes on the wings. But anyway, one night, all these birds were going crazy. You could hear all of them flapping and crying out like they were scared. I wanted to go outside with them and see what was going on, but my father told me that I was too little and had to stay inside with my mom. So my father, my older brother, and my grandfather all went out to see what was going on, thinking that there was a cat or some other kind of animal out there that was trying to get into the coop and eat the parakeets. When they went out there, they didn't see anything, but they said the air felt funny to them. All three of them described the air as making them tingle, like static electricity or something. My grandfather even said that he felt dizzy while he was out there. All three of them heard strange noises and described them as hisses and growls. They were coming from the bushes, and then they heard something move, and they heard the hisses up in a tree. But they looked around and couldn't find anything. All three of them were confused because, as far as they knew, nothing around where we lived would prey on parakeets, unless it was a cat. But it didn't sound like a cat. I remember being frightened. That night, I didn't even want to sleep. I was thinking it was some kind of monster, and I ended up sleeping in my grandparents' room. My grandma told me there was no such thing as monsters, and that helped calm me down enough to where I could actually fall asleep. The next morning, I got teased by my older brothers for being a wimp because I slept with my grandparents, but I didn't care. It was a comfort for me. A few nights later, while my grandparents were in town and my older brother was at his job, we heard the same ruckus. The parakeets started going crazy again and acting very frightened. My father ran out there with a flashlight and a club and told my other brother and my mom to keep me in the house and keep an eye on my little sister. When he ran to the chicken coop, he found that the door was broken open and the parakeets were all fluttering around, very scared. They couldn't fly away because their wings were clipped. It was just one of the precautions my grandpa took so he wouldn't lose any of the birds. But anyway, my father found a few birds that were already dead and saw this creature with another bird in its hands. My father told us later that he thought it was the devil. He thought it'd come to our home and then started eating these poor birds. But at the end, my grandfather had a better idea of what it could be. My father described this creature as greenish-brown in color, and it looked like it could have been covered in scales, but it also had a little bit of hair on it too. It was standing on two legs and had long claws and toes on the hands. The hands only had a few fingers, but my dad isn't sure exactly how many. It had these big, bulbous red eyes that looked like they were glowing. No nose, and a mouth full of big teeth. It came up almost to his waist in height, and the legs looked very muscular for a creature of its size. It had what my father thinks were spikes or spines on its back, and only a small bit of white fur that was on the legs, the chest, and the back. There was no hair anywhere on its head or face. My father raced up to it with his club and began beating at it and yelling at it to go away. He was telling it that God demanded that it leave, and no evil was welcome on this property. He chased this thing around in there, beating it with the club while it was making this horrible screaming noise. That part we could actually hear from inside the house. It sounded like nothing I've ever heard before in my entire life. I've never heard anything like that since either, but it's still something that I can hear in my mind. As these two were running around in the coop, the parakeets were still going crazy, and this creature was moving in a hopping motion, but was very fast. My dad was trying to block the doorway so he could beat this thing to death, but it managed to escape anyway. It ran through the door, but my dad kept beating on it. Outside of the coop, it made the scream, but even louder this time, and then turned around to defend itself. When it turned, it leapt in the air and pounced on my dad and attacked him. It tried to claw him, but my dad kept fighting it off and hitting it with the club and punching it with his free hand. They ended up falling to the ground, and my dad started kicking at this creature as it clawed at his arms and legs. My dad described the claws as talons like a bird of prey. They were long and curved and sharp. As it was attacking him, it kept making that horrible screaming noise, and it would hiss at him as well. He was finally able to beat the creature off, and it ran into the bushes. The same bushes that they believed they heard this thing in the first time. When it did run off, it was still making that hopping motion that my dad described kind of like a kangaroo. The creature was gone, but my dad was very hurt. We took him to the local hospital, and the doctors treated his wounds. He had a lot of slashes and cuts on him from the creature, and when he fell, he scraped up his legs and hands. He ended up getting a lot of stitches and was taken off work for a few weeks to heal. And he was also given a couple of injections of antibiotics and sent home with some too. When he was brought home from the hospital, we all sat around the dinner table as a family, and he described what happened to him. He told us what he'd seen. My mom was convinced that it was a demon, but my grandparents had other ideas. Grandfather was convinced that it was the Chupacabra. That was a creature that I never gave two thoughts about existing. It was just a fairy tale. It was only told to me when I was acting up, tried to keep me in line. My brothers used to talk about the Chupacabra and told me that it was imaginary. It was a tactic that my parents used to scare us into behaving. After that night, the entire family believed in the existence of Chupacabras, because my dad had actually fought one off. We never saw that creature again, but my dad still has the scars to prove that he was attacked by some sort of creature. There's nothing else in Puerto Rico that matches the description of the Chupacabra, and in fact, there's no other creature on Earth that matches the description that our dad gave us. I believe him. I believe he was attacked by the Chupacabra that night, and I thank God every night to this day that he was able to survive the encounter.